thought I knew my husband. 8 years of marriage teaches you things. The way someone breathes in their sleep, the exact sound of their footsteps on hardwood floors, the particular way they stir their coffee in the morning. I knew David Mitchell the way you know the layout of your own home in the dark, or so I believed. Until the afternoon, a woman I'd never seen before knocked on my door, holding the hand of a little boy who had my husband's eyes. It was a Saturday in early October. I remember because the maple tree in our front yard had just started to turn, those first few leaves blushing red at the edges like they were embarrassed by their own beauty. I'd been grading papers at the kitchen table, a stack of sophomore essays on The Great Gatsby spread out before me, each one a variation on the theme of illusion versus reality. The irony wouldn't hit me until later. When the doorbell rang, I assumed it was a package delivery, or maybe the neighbor's kid selling something for a school fundraiser. I opened the door with a polite smile already arranged on my face, the kind of smile that says, "I'm friendly, but please make this quick." The woman standing on my porch was younger than me, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and tired eyes that held something between determination and desperation. She wore jeans and a faded blue sweater, the kind of outfit that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. But it was the child that made my breath catch. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead in the exact same way David's did when he forgot to comb it. Those eyes, hazel with flecks of gold, stared up at me with innocent curiosity. The woman's voice trembled when she spoke. "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" I nodded, confused, my hand still gripping the door frame. She took a breath that seemed to cost her something. "I'm Rebecca Turner. I know who you are. David told me about you, but he never said you were still married." The words came at me like stones, each one landing with increasing weight. Still married. The present tense of it. The implication hanging in the autumn air between us. The little boy tugged at her hand. "Mama, is this the lady Daddy talks about?" My legs went weak. The porch seemed to tilt beneath me. I heard myself ask, in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else, "Who is this child?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "This is Liam. He's David's son." The world narrowed to a pinpoint and then exploded outward. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car drove past. The maple tree rustled in the breeze. Normal sounds in a moment that was shattering the entire architecture of my life. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't process the impossible things she was saying. Rebecca's voice continued, softer now, almost apologetic. "I thought you two were divorced. He told me it ended 3 years ago. He said you'd moved on. I never would have..." Her voice broke. "I would never have started something with a married man. You have to believe me. 3 years. The number ricocheted through my skull. 3 years ago, David had taken that promotion that required more travel. 3 years of business trips and late nights and, "Sorry, honey. I'll be home next week instead." 3 years of me waiting, trusting, believing in the man I'd married in a small church ceremony surrounded by people who told us how perfect we were together. And all that time, he'd been building another life, another family, another version of himself that I'd never even suspected existed. Before that October afternoon, my life with David Mitchell had looked, from the outside, like something from a modest American dream. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. I taught 11th grade English at Riverside High School, the same school I'd graduated from 15 years earlier. David worked as a regional sales representative for a medical supply company, a job that sounded more impressive than it probably was, but paid well enough for us to afford our small 2-bedroom house on Elm Street. It had a front porch I'd always loved, a backyard just big enough for the garden I kept meaning to start, and a mortgage we were slowly but steadily paying down. Our mornings followed a rhythm we'd established early in our marriage. I'd wake first, usually around 6, and start the coffee maker. That familiar gurgling sound that meant the day was beginning. David would emerge from the bedroom about 15 minutes later, hair still damp from the shower, smelling of the same cedar soap he'd used since college. He'd kiss the top of my head as he passed, a gesture so routine it had become almost invisible, and pour himself a cup in the blue mug I'd bought him on our honeymoon in Asheville. We'd sit at the small kitchen table, him scrolling through emails on his phone, me reviewing my lesson plans, existing in that comfortable silence that long-married couples mistake for intimacy. The distance had crept in so gradually, I'd barely noticed it happening. Looking back, I can pinpoint when things shifted. About 3 years ago, just after David accepted the promotion that required extensive regional travel. Suddenly, he was gone 3 or 4 days a week, sometimes longer. Monday mornings, I'd watch him pack his navy rolling suitcase, always in the same methodical way. Dress shirts first, then pants, toiletries in the side pocket. His goodbye kisses became quick, distracted. "Love you? See you Thursday?" delivered over his shoulder as he grabbed his car keys. "Don't wait up if I'm late." I'd rationalized it all. He was stressed about the new position. He was tired from the constant driving. He was trying to prove himself to his bosses. When he'd come home on Friday evenings looking exhausted, I'd make his favorite dinner, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the recipe his mother had taught me. He'd eat quietly, offer a tired smile, and retreat to the living room to watch television. Our conversations became transactional. "Did you pay the electric bill? Your mom called. I need you to look at the kitchen faucet this weekend. It's dripping again." The signs had been there all along, scattered through our marriage like breadcrumbs I'd been too trusting, or too afraid, to follow. It started with small things, inconsistencies so minor they seemed paranoid to question. About 6 months before Rebecca appeared at my door, I'd found a restaurant receipt in David's jacket pocket while sorting laundry. Bella Nota, an Italian place in Springfield, dated on a Tuesday evening. The total suggested 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, tiramisu for dessert. When I'd casually mentioned it over breakfast the next morning, "How was Springfield? Did you have a nice dinner?" David had barely looked up from his phone. "Springfield? I wasn't in Springfield last week. I was in Northfield. Must be an old receipt." But it wasn't old. The date was clear, printed in that faded thermal ink that restaurant receipts use. I'd stood there holding his coffee mug, watching him butter his toast, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. It would have been so easy to push, to ask more questions, to demand he check his calendar or his credit card statements. Instead, I'd folded the receipt and tucked it into my wallet, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe he'd confused his schedule. Maybe he'd given a colleague a ride and they'd stopped for dinner. Maybe I was remembering the date wrong. The phone calls started happening more frequently around that same time. We'd be sitting in the living room, me grading papers, him supposedly answering work emails, when his phone would buzz. He'd glance at the screen, and his entire body would change. Shoulders tensing, jaw tightening just slightly. "I need to take this," he'd say, already standing, already moving toward the back door. He'd step out onto the patio, and through the window I could see his silhouette pacing, one hand running through his hair in that gesture he made when he was stressed. When he came back inside, I'd ask, "Everything okay?" And he'd offer some vague explanation about a difficult client or a shipment issue, but his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. Then there was the perfume. I noticed it one Thursday evening when David came home from what he'd said was a 4-day trip to the Eastern Territory. He'd dropped his overnight bag by the washing machine, kissed my cheek with the same distracted affection he always showed, and headed straight for the shower. While making dinner, I'd picked up his dress shirt from the top of the laundry pile, intending to pre-treat a stain, and caught a scent that made me freeze. It was floral, sweet, definitely feminine, and definitely not my perfume. I wore a light citrus scent, the same one for years. This was something heavier, more romantic. Roses, maybe, or jasmine. I'd held that shirt to my face, breathing in evidence of something I didn't want to believe, and felt my heart hammering against my ribs. There were explanations, I told myself. He'd hugged a colleague. Someone had bumped into him in an elevator. But my hands were shaking as I loaded the washing machine. That night, lying in bed beside him, I'd stayed awake listening to his breathing, wondering who he'd been with, wondering if I was losing my mind. The worst was the photograph. I hadn't meant to snoop. At least that's what I told myself. David had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he was mowing the lawn, and a text notification had lit up the screen. Just the preview, nothing more. "Miss you already." No name, just a phone number I didn't recognize. My finger hovered over the phone. Every principle I had about trust and privacy screamed at me not to look. But something stronger, some instinct I'd been suppressing for months, made me pick it up. I didn't unlock it. I couldn't bring myself to cross that line. But the screen was still illuminated, showing his photo gallery in the background. The most recent picture wasn't of me, wasn't of us. It was slightly out of focus, taken quickly, but I could make out what looked like a woman's figure, her back to the camera, standing in what appeared to be a kitchen I didn't recognize. The walls were yellow. Our kitchen walls were white. Before I could look closer, I heard the lawnmower stop. I set the phone down exactly where I'd found it, my heart racing like I'd committed a crime. David came in moments later, sweaty and smiling, asking what was for dinner. I told him spaghetti. I didn't tell him about the text, or the photo, or the terrible certainty growing inside me that my husband was keeping secrets I wasn't prepared to uncover. Standing on my porch that October afternoon, looking at Rebecca Turner and the little boy whose existence was impossible, I felt reality fracture. The conversation that followed happened in fragments, sentences that landed like physical blows. Rebecca's voice kept breaking, apologizing, explaining. She'd met David almost 4 years ago at a medical conference in Chicago where she'd been working registration for the hotel. He'd been charming, attentive, said he was recently divorced, trying to start over. They'd exchanged numbers. He'd called. They'd started seeing each other whenever his work travel brought him to the area, which turned out to be every single week. He rented an apartment, Rebecca said, and I had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. On the north side of Henderson, about 40 minutes from here. He said he needed something close to his territory for work. I didn't know he had another house. I didn't know he had... She looked at me with genuine anguish. A wife he was still living with. The word still cut through me, as if our marriage was something he'd mentioned casually as past tense, a chapter already closed. Liam tugged at his mother's hand again, bored with the adult conversation, wanting to go home. Home. The word took on a sickening new dimension. Where was home for this child? The apartment David had rented? With what money? Our joint account, probably. The one I'd never monitored carefully because I'd trusted him completely. How many nights had he kissed me goodbye, driven away in our shared Honda, and gone to play house with another family? Rebecca was still talking, her words rushing together like she needed to get them all out before she lost her nerve. David had been there for Liam's birth. He'd been present, involved, loving. He visited every week, sometimes twice a week. He took the boy to the park, read him bedtime stories, taught him to ride a tricycle. He was, by all accounts, a good father, to a child I'd never known existed, a child who carried David's features in his face like genetic proof of my husband's double life. I only found out the truth last week, Rebecca said, tears streaming down her cheeks now. I needed to reach him. Liam was sick, running a fever, and David wasn't answering his phone. I got scared and looked up his company's main office number. When I called, the receptionist said he was on vacation. With his wife, she said. They're celebrating their anniversary in Vermont. That's when I knew something was terribly wrong. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. Your anniversary was last week, wasn't it? It had been. 8 years. David had taken me to a bed and breakfast in Burlington. A surprise trip he'd planned for months, he said. We'd walked around Lake Champlain, eaten at waterfront restaurants, slept in a room with exposed wooden beams and a fireplace. He'd held my hand. He'd told me he loved me. And the entire time, Rebecca had been alone in Henderson, trying to reach him, worried about their sick son, slowly realizing that the man she'd built a relationship with had been lying about everything. I don't remember inviting Rebecca inside, but suddenly we were sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where David and I had eaten breakfast that very morning, and she was showing me photographs on her phone. David at the hospital, holding a newborn Liam. David on a beach somewhere, the boy on his shoulders. David at a birthday party, a cake with 4 candles, Liam's face covered in chocolate frosting. Each image was a knife twisting deeper. These weren't stolen moments or one-night mistakes. This was a sustained, deliberate construction of an alternate reality. He told me he worked long hours, Rebecca said quietly. That's why he could only visit certain days. I thought he was just dedicated to his job. She looked around my kitchen, taking in the evidence of my life with David, the wedding photo on the wall, the coffee mugs hanging from hooks, his jacket still draped over the back of a chair. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to be the other woman. I never wanted to hurt anyone. When I realized what he'd done to both of us, I knew I had to tell you. You deserve to know the truth. The truth. Such a simple word for something that was tearing through my life like a tornado, leaving nothing intact. Liam had wandered into the living room and was examining the bookshelf, running his small fingers along the spines. I watched him touch a framed photo of David and me from our wedding day, both of us young and smiling and stupidly, blissfully unaware of how it would all end. The boy looked back at me with David's eyes, and I realized with horrifying clarity that this child was innocent. He was just a little boy who loved his father, who had no idea that his very existence was destroying a stranger's world. Rebecca stood to leave, gathering Liam with gentle hands. "I don't know what happens now," she said. "I don't know what to do either, but I thought you should know. We both deserve better than his lies." After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen as afternoon faded into evening, the graded essays still scattered across the table, the maple tree outside turning redder with each passing day, and I waited for my husband to come home. David came home at 7:30 that evening, right on schedule, carrying Chinese takeout in white paper bags that smelled of garlic and ginger. He called out, "Honey, I'm home," in that casual, unchanged voice that felt obscene given everything I now knew. I was sitting in the darkening living room, hadn't bothered to turn on the lights, and when he walked in and saw me there, just sitting, hands folded in my lap, face probably unreadable in the shadows, he paused. "Sarah, you okay?" The concern in his voice sounded so genuine it made me want to scream. I turned on the lamp beside me. The sudden light made him blink. "A woman came to see me today," I said, and watched his face cycle through confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like panic, before settling into a careful blankness. "Her name is Rebecca Turner. She had a little boy with her, Liam, 5 years old. Your eyes." Each sentence landed in the space between us like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of consequence outward. What followed was the conversation that ends marriages. David set the takeout bags on the coffee table with shaking hands. He sat down heavily in the armchair across from me, the same chair where he'd sat thousands of times before to watch football or read the newspaper. But now everything about the gesture felt like I was watching a stranger perform an imitation of my husband. He didn't deny it. I suppose that's something, though at the time it felt like the smallest mercy in an ocean of betrayal. "I never meant for this to happen," he started, and I held up my hand to stop him because that particular cliché was too much to bear. He tried again. "It started as nothing. Just someone to talk to when I was on the road, feeling lonely. You were so busy with work. And I was gone all the time, and we'd stopped really seeing each other." The implication hung there, that somehow our comfortable silence, our routine, our normal marriage, had justified building an entire secret family. I asked him questions in a voice that didn't sound like mine, calm and clinical like I was conducting an interview. "How long?" "Almost 4 years. Did he love her?" "He didn't know," he said, which felt worse than a simple yes. "Had he planned to leave me?" "No, never," he swore. He'd somehow convinced himself he could manage both lives, make both women happy, keep all the pieces separate. "I was trying to protect everyone," he said, which was so absurd I finally lost my composure and laughed, a harsh sound that startled us both. "You have a son," I said. "A child who calls you daddy, who draws pictures for you, who thinks you're his hero." I'd seen those drawings in Rebecca's photos, crayon stick figures labeled me and daddy. David put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. He was crying, making small wounded sounds, and I felt nothing. No sympathy, no urge to comfort him. Just a vast hollow space where 8 years of trust used to live. The worst part was how ordinary it all seemed. No dramatic throwing of objects, no screaming matches, just 2 people sitting in a living room that still smelled like Chinese food, dismantling a marriage with quiet, devastating words. He asked if there was any way to fix this, if we could try counseling, if I could possibly forgive him. I told him to pack a bag and leave. He hesitated, looked around the room like he was cataloging what he was losing, then nodded and went upstairs. I heard drawers opening and closing, the sound of the zipper on his suitcase, his footsteps moving through the house we'd chosen together. When he came back down 20 minutes later, overnight bag in hand, he paused at the door. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry for all of it." I didn't respond. What was there to say? Sorry doesn't unwrite 4 years of lies. Sorry doesn't erase a child's existence. Sorry doesn't rebuild a wife's shattered sense of reality. He left, the door clicking shut behind him, with a finality that echoed through the sudden silence. I sat in that living room until the takeout went cold, until the streetlights came on outside, until my body started to register what my mind already knew. I was alone in a way I'd never been alone before. The kind of alone that comes from discovering the person you trusted most was a fiction, a performance, a man who could kiss you goodbye in the morning and read bedtime stories to another woman's child at night. 3 months passed like a fever dream. I moved through the mechanics of divorce with the help of a lawyer whose office smelled like old books and stale coffee. David didn't contest anything. He signed the papers, split the assets, agreed to everything with an eagerness that felt like its own kind of insult, as if giving me the house and half his pension could somehow balance the scale. Rebecca called me once, 2 weeks after everything fell apart, to apologize again, and to tell me she'd ended things with David. Neither of us can trust him now, she'd said quietly. Liam asks about him every day. I don't know what to tell a 5-year-old about why Daddy isn't coming anymore. I'd felt a strange kinship with her in that moment. 2 women dismantled by the same man's capacity for deception. The physical signs of grief were unexpected. I lost 12 pounds without trying, my clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to be disappearing. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie in bed, now pushed against the wall where David's side used to be, and count the ceiling cracks until dawn. The panic attack started in week 3, sudden moments where my heart would race and my chest would constrict, and I'd have to sit down wherever I was. Just breathe, just survive the next 60 seconds. My doctor prescribed something to help me sleep, something else for the anxiety. I took them mechanically. One more item on the list of things required to keep functioning. I returned to teaching after 2 weeks off, citing a family emergency to the school administration. The students were kind in that awkward teenage way, pretending not to notice my red-rimmed eyes, or the fact that I'd worn the same cardigan 3 days in a row. Teaching became autopilot. I'd delivered these lessons so many times I could do it while my brain was somewhere else entirely, replaying moments from my marriage, looking for the places where I'd been too blind to see the truth. Had he thought of them when he was with me? Had he compared us? Had every "I love you" been a calculation about which woman he was supposed to be with at that moment? I started going to a coffee shop near the school, a small place called Morning Grace that I'd passed 1,000 times but never entered. It became part of a new routine I was building from scratch. Wake up, shower, dress, teach, grade papers at Morning Grace, go home, take pills, sleep, repeat. I always ordered the same thing. Black coffee, no sugar, nothing to soften it. I always sat in the back corner by the window that looked out onto a side street where oak trees dropped their leaves in slow, golden surrender. I'd bring a book, something I was supposed to be reading for my American literature class, but mostly I'd just hold it open on the table and stare at the words until they blurred. The coffee shop became a kind of refuge, a place where nobody knew me or my story. The barista was a young woman with purple hair who never asked questions, just made my coffee the same way every time, and slid it across the counter with a small smile. The other regulars were strangers absorbed in their own lives. A man who always worked on his laptop in frantic bursts of typing, an elderly couple who shared a muffin and read separate sections of the newspaper, a group of college students who debated philosophy loud enough to be distracting. I liked being around people who didn't need anything from me, who didn't offer sympathetic looks or well-meaning advice about how time heals all wounds. Outside the window, autumn was turning to winter. The oak trees went from gold to bare, their branches reaching up like supplicating hands against increasingly gray skies. I watched the season change with a kind of detached observation, noting it the way you'd note any natural phenomenon that has nothing to do with you. On Thanksgiving, my mother called asking when I'd arrive for dinner, and I lied and said the school needed me to chaperone an event. I spent the day at home, eating toast and watching television shows I'd never remember, grateful for the silence. It happened on a Tuesday in early December, one of those gray afternoons where the cold seeps into your bones and makes everything feel heavier. I'd just finished a particularly exhausting parent-teacher conference. A mother convinced her son's failing grade was somehow my fault, and I needed the coffee shop more than usual. The bell above the door chimed as I entered Morning Grace, and the familiar warmth and smell of roasted beans felt like the closest thing to comfort I could manage these days. I was distracted, already rehearsing my usual order in my head, when I miscalculated the step up from the entrance. My boot caught the edge, and suddenly I was stumbling forward, my bag sliding off my shoulder, arms windmilling in that graceless way bodies move when balance abandons them. The coffee I'd just been handed went flying, the paper cup spinning through the air in what felt like slow motion before hitting the hardwood floor with a wet smack. Dark liquid spread across the worn boards, steaming slightly in the cool air from the open door behind me. The heat of embarrassment flooded my face immediately. Several people looked up from their tables. The purple-haired barista grabbed a towel and started coming around the counter. I dropped to my knees, mortified, trying to use napkins from my bag to contain the spreading puddle, my hands shaking partly from adrenaline and partly from the humiliation of being the center of attention. "I'm so sorry," I kept saying to no one in particular, to everyone, to the universe that seemed determined to strip away every last shred of my dignity. Then someone else was kneeling beside me. I noticed the hands first, large, weathered, with calluses along the palms and what looked like old wood stain under the nails. They moved with careful efficiency, gathering the soaked napkins, using a bandana from his pocket to soak up the worst of it. "Easy," a voice said, calm and unhurried. "It's just coffee. Nothing that can't be fixed." Something about the way he said it, not dismissive, but genuinely reassuring, made me look up. He was older than me, maybe late 30s, with brown hair starting to show gray at the temples and lines around his eyes that suggested someone who spent time outdoors. He wore work clothes, a flannel shirt over a thermal, jeans with worn knees, boots that had seen serious use. His face had a quiet steadiness to it, the kind of face that didn't need to prove anything. When our eyes met, his were a warm brown, and there was something in them that wasn't pity exactly, but understanding, like he'd seen people fall apart before, and knew that sometimes the small disasters were really about the bigger ones. The barista arrived with a mop, insisting she'd handle it, shooing us both away with practiced efficiency. The man stood and offered me his hand. I took it, let him pull me to my feet, feeling the solid strength of his grip. "Thank you," I managed, still clutching my bag, still feeling the heat in my cheeks. I trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. Usually what? Usually have complete control of my life? That ship had sailed months ago. He smiled, a small expression that reached his eyes. "We all have those days," he said. Then, after a pause, "or those months." The addition was so unexpected, so specific, that I found myself actually looking at him, instead of just trying to escape the situation. He gestured to the counter. "Let me buy you another coffee. Least I can do since I didn't catch you before you hit the ground." There was no flirtation in it, no agenda I could detect, just a simple offer from one human to another. I should have said no. I should have made an excuse and left and maintained the careful isolation I'd built around myself. But something in his voice, that comment about months instead of days, made me think he might understand what it was like to be barely held together. "Okay," I heard myself say. "Thank you. That's kind." We stood at the counter while the purple-haired barista made 2 fresh coffees, his regular order and my usual black. In the awkward silence, I noticed things about him. The way he held himself with a relaxed posture that suggested comfort in his own skin. The faint smell of sawdust that clung to his clothes. The small scar above his left eyebrow. When the coffees came, he carried both to a table by the window. The same window where I usually sat alone. "I'm James," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "James Hartwell." "Sarah Mitchell," I replied automatically. Then added, "Sarah Brennan, actually." "I'm changing it back." The words came out before I could stop them, and I felt my face flush again. Why was I telling a complete stranger about my divorce? But James just nodded, no surprise in his expression, no judgment. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and looked out the window at the bare trees. "Fresh starts are good," he said quietly. "Hard, but good." And something about the way he said it made me think he wasn't just making conversation. He was speaking from experience. From some territory of loss I recognized, because I was living there myself. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment. 2 strangers who'd collided over spilled coffee, and for the first time in 3 months, the weight in my chest felt fractionally lighter. Not gone, not even close, but bearable. Like maybe I could survive the next hour, the next day, the next season of bare trees and cold mornings. James took a sip of his coffee, glanced at me with those steady brown eyes and said, "You come here often?" It should have been a cliché, a pickup line, but somehow it wasn't. It was just a question, a genuine one, and I realized I wanted to answer it. James Hartwell started appearing at Morning Grace at the same time I did. Not every day. His work schedule seemed irregular, but often enough that it became something I noticed, then something I anticipated, then something I'd feel quietly disappointed about when he wasn't there. We fell into an easy pattern of sharing a table, our conversation starting with small observations and gradually deepening into something more substantial. He told me he was a carpenter, that he worked mostly on custom furniture and small renovation projects, that he'd learned the trade from his grandfather. I told him I taught high school English, that I loved literature, but lately the books felt hollow, that I was trying to remember who I'd been before everything fell apart. He never asked what had fallen apart, never pushed for details about the divorce I'd accidentally mentioned that first day. Instead, he told me about wood, how different species had different personalities, how oak was stubborn but reliable, how pine was forgiving but soft, how walnut had a depth to it that revealed itself slowly over time. The way he talked about his work had a meditative quality, and I found myself actually listening, actually present in conversations, instead of just waiting for them to end. When I mentioned I was reading Gatsby with my juniors, he surprised me by saying he'd read it twice, once in high school because he had to, once in his 30s because he wanted to. "It's different when you're older," he'd said. "When you've lost something you can't get back." 3 weeks after we met, he showed up at the coffee shop carrying a book. Not just any book, a worn paperback of The Color Purple by Alice Walker. He set it on the table between us with an almost shy gesture. "You mentioned you were looking for something to read that wasn't part of your curriculum," he said. "I thought you might like this one. It's about a woman who survives things that should have broken her." I picked up the book, felt the cracked spine that indicated multiple readings, saw the penciled notes in the margins. "This is your copy," I said, surprised. He nodded. "I want you to have it. I think you'd appreciate it more than I can explain." I took the book home that night and read it in one sitting, curled up on my couch with tea going cold on the side table. He was right. It wrecked me and put me back together in equal measure. The next day at the coffee shop, I thanked him, my voice thick with emotion I hadn't expected to feel about a novel. "How did you know?" I asked. He smiled that small, knowing smile. "Sometimes we need to see how someone else survived the unsurvivable," he said. "Helps us believe we can do it too." After that, books became part of our conversation. He'd recommend something, I'd read it, we'd discuss it over coffee. But it wasn't just about literature. It was about the way we were slowly, carefully learning each other's stories through the safe distance of fiction. When I mentioned I was struggling to find meaning in anything, he brought me Mary Oliver poems. When I told him I felt angry all the time, a rage that had nowhere to go, he suggested Wild by Cheryl Strayed. Each book was chosen with thought, with purpose, with an understanding of exactly where I was in my grief. One particularly difficult afternoon, the anniversary of what would have been my 9th wedding anniversary, I showed up at Morning Grace barely holding myself together. James took one look at my face and said, "Come with me." I followed him out to his truck, an old Ford with sawdust in the bed and tools carefully organized in a lockbox. He drove us to his workshop, a converted barn on the edge of town that smelled like wood shavings and mineral oil. "I find it helps," he said, "to make something with your hands when your head won't stop spinning." He set me up at a workbench with a piece of soft pine and some sandpaper, showed me how to feel the grain, how to work with it instead of against it, how the repetitive motion could quiet the noise. For 2 hours I sanded that piece of wood, feeling the surface go from rough to smooth under my palms, watching the dust accumulate, focusing on nothing but the physical sensation of making something better than it had been. James worked nearby on a table he was building, the sound of his tools a steady rhythm. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty comfort. He just let me exist in my pain, while showing me there was still something I could control, something I could improve, even if it was just a plank of wood. When I finally set down the sandpaper, my arms aching, my mind finally quiet, he came over to examine my work. ran his own calloused hands over the smooth surface. "Beautiful," he said. "You have patient hands." I looked at him, this man who'd appeared in my life at the exact moment I'd needed someone to show me that gentleness still existed, and felt something crack open in my chest, not breaking further, healing, the painful kind of healing where you have to feel everything before it gets better. "Thank you," I said, and meant it for more than just the woodworking lesson. He seemed to understand. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah Brennan," he said quietly. "I see it, even if you don't yet." On the drive back to the coffee shop where my car was parked, I held the piece of wood in my lap, still warm from my hands, and thought about how sometimes salvation comes in the form of sawdust and silence, and someone who knows exactly when not to speak. It was James who invited me to dinner, but it took him 3 weeks to work up to it. I could see him considering it sometimes, the way he'd pause mid-sentence at the coffee shop, like he was about to say something more, then change his mind and redirect the conversation. I didn't push. Whatever was growing between us felt fragile, precious in a way that made me cautious. I'd been wrong about love before, catastrophically wrong, and the thought of trusting my judgment again terrified me. When he finally asked, it was simple and direct in that way he had of cutting through complications. We were standing outside Morning Grace on a Friday evening, the winter sun already setting at 5 o'clock, our breath making clouds in the cold air. "Sarah," he said, "would you come have dinner at my place tomorrow? Nothing fancy, just food I make myself and conversation that doesn't have to end when the coffee shop closes." The vulnerability in his voice was unmistakable. He was taking a risk too, I realized. Whatever his own story was, and I'd learned enough to know there was one, he was choosing to trust me with it. His house was exactly what I should have expected, and somehow still surprised me. He'd built it himself, he told me, as we pulled up the gravel driveway, over the course of 3 years. It was small, but perfectly proportioned. All clean lines and exposed beams, with windows that caught the last rays of sunlight and made the interior glow amber. Everything inside showed the same careful attention. A dining table made from reclaimed barnwood, chairs that fit the hand exactly right, shelves that displayed books and small carved figures with the precision of someone who understood balance and negative space. He'd set the table with cloth napkins and candles that weren't trying too hard, just providing warm light. The smell of roasting chicken and herbs filled the space. He poured wine into simple glasses, and we sat down to eat food that was surprisingly good. He'd learned to cook, he said, during the years he'd lived alone, and decided frozen dinners were too depressing to sustain. The conversation flowed easily at first, the way it always did with us, but underneath I could feel something building, some inevitable moment approaching that we'd both been avoiding. It came after dinner, when we'd moved to the living room and were sitting on his couch with second glasses of wine. The candles burned down to stubs, the house settling into evening sounds around us. James set down his glass and turned to face me fully, his expression serious. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before this goes any further, because you deserve to know who you're spending time with." He told me about Emily, his wife, ex-wife now, who he'd loved completely, who he'd married young and built a life with. They'd tried for years to have children, went through treatments and failures and hope and disappointment in cycles that strained everything between them. And then, when they'd finally decided to stop trying, to accept it would be just the two of them, she'd met someone at her office, someone who already had 2 kids from a previous marriage, someone who could give her the family she'd always wanted in a way James never could. "She left on a Tuesday," he said, his voice steady, but his hands gripping his wine glass tight enough that I worried it might break. "Packed her things while I was at work, left a note on the kitchen counter explaining that she'd found what she needed, and she was sorry, but she couldn't stay anymore. 3 years of silence and distance just collapsed into one afternoon of empty closets and goodbye." The parallel wasn't lost on either of us. Different details, different betrayals, but the same foundational truth. We'd both loved people who'd chosen other lives, other futures that didn't include us. "I was angry for a long time," James continued. "Angry at her, angry at myself for not seeing it coming, angry at the whole unfair randomness of it. I threw myself into work, built this house because I needed to create something I had complete control over, something that wouldn't leave." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw in his eyes the same fragile hope I felt in my chest. "But then I met you," he said. This woman who'd been shattered and was putting herself back together piece by piece, who was brave enough to keep showing up even when everything hurt. And I realized I didn't want to hide anymore. I didn't want to just survive. I wanted, his voice caught, I wanted to try again. With you. If you're willing. My hands were shaking. I set down my wine glass before I could drop it. James, I don't know if I know how to do this anymore, I said, the words rushing out. I don't know if I trust my own judgment. I was married to a man for 8 years and never saw what he was. How do I trust that I see you clearly? How do I trust that you won't? I couldn't finish the sentence. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away if I needed to, and took my hands in his. Those carpenter's hands, rough and warm and steady. You don't have to trust perfectly, he said. You just have to be willing to try. And I promise you this. I'm not him. I'm not perfect. I've got my own damage and complicated history. But I'm here. Fully here. Not building other lives in other cities. Just this one life. And I'd like you in it. Not as someone to fix you. Because you're not broken. Just as someone who wants to walk beside you while we both keep healing. I looked at our joined hands, felt the calluses on his palms that came from years of honest work, from building real things with care and patience, and I made a choice. Not to trust completely, not to abandon all caution, but to believe that maybe, possibly, this man with sawdust under his nails and books in his margins was exactly who he appeared to be. Someone who'd been hurt and survived it. Someone who understood that love after loss required courage. Okay, I whispered. Okay, let's try. He smiled. That small, genuine smile that reached his eyes and pulled me gently toward him. When he kissed me, it was careful and questioning. Nothing assumed, just an offering I could accept or refuse. I kissed him back, tasting wine and possibility, and the terrifying hope that maybe I could have this, could be loved again, could choose someone who would choose me back every single day. Not because of obligation or habit or the inertia of years together, but because of a conscious decision to stay. Topic 10. Catharsis and rebirth. 6 months later, I found myself sitting on a park bench in the center of town, watching the spring flowers push through the last of the winter-hard ground, the same bench where I'd sat alone back in December, crying so hard I'd scared a passing jogger who'd asked if I needed help. I'd told her I was fine, which had been a lie then but felt closer to truth now. James sat beside me, his arm draped across the back of the bench, his presence solid and unhurried in that way he had of existing in the world. We'd just come from morning grace, where the purple-haired barista had teased us about being regulars, who'd finally made it official. James had laughed, his hand finding mine under the table in that absent, comfortable way of people who've learned each other's bodies and no longer need to think about every touch. I'd smiled, too, something that happened more easily now, though the shadows hadn't completely lifted. I don't think they ever fully do when you've been broken the way I was, but I'd learned to carry them differently. I saw David last week, I said, breaking the comfortable silence. James didn't tense or pull away, just waited for me to continue. At the grocery store. He was in the produce section looking tired. We made eye contact and he started to come over, but I just shook my head and he stopped. Stood there holding a bag of apples like he couldn't remember what he was supposed to do with them. How did that feel? James asked, not because he was worried, but because he genuinely wanted to know. Sad, I said honestly. Not for me or not mostly for me. Just sad that he'd had everything and threw it away because he thought he could have more. Rebecca told me he's been trying to get back into Liam's life, but she's making him prove himself first. Supervised visits, counseling, all the things he should have done from the beginning. I paused, watching a robin pull a worm from the newly soft earth. I used to think I'd feel victorious, seeing him diminish like that, but I just felt empty about it, like it was someone else's story I'd heard about. Not mine. James squeezed my hand. That means you're healing, he said. When it stops being the central story of your life, when you can see it from a distance. I leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his shoulder, smelling the familiar scent of sawdust and soap. I never thought I'd be able to feel this again, I said quietly. Not just the being with someone part, but the trusting it part, the believing it's real part. It is real, James said, turning to look at me with those steady brown eyes that had never once lied to me. Every day I choose this. Choose you. Choose us. That's what makes it different from what you had before. He was managing, dividing, calculating. I'm just here. Completely. A group of children ran past, chasing each other around the pavilion, their laughter high and careless in the spring air. I watched them and thought about Liam, that little boy who'd shown up at my door and unknowingly detonated my entire life. I hoped he was okay. I hoped Rebecca was giving him the stability he needed. I hoped, in some distant future, he'd understand that none of it had been his fault, that he'd been an innocent caught in the wreckage of adult failures. Thank you, I said to James, the words inadequate for everything I wanted to express, for showing me that I could still be loved, that I was worth loving, that the story didn't have to end with betrayal. He pulled me closer, pressed a kiss to the top of my head. You showed yourself that, he said. I just had the privilege of being here while you figured it out. You're the bravest person I know, Sarah Brennan. You took the worst thing that could have happened and didn't let it make you bitter. You kept your heart open, even when it would have been easier to close it forever. We sat there as the afternoon stretched toward evening, watching the light change, watching people walk past living their own complicated stories. Somewhere across town, David was probably sitting in his apartment, alone with his choices. Somewhere Rebecca was making dinner for Liam, building a life from the rubble. And here I was, on a bench in a park, with a man whose hands knew how to build things that lasted, learning that love after devastation was possible. Not the same love I'd had before. That innocent, unquestioning trust was gone forever. But something deeper, something earned, something built with the full knowledge that people can hurt you, and choosing to be vulnerable anyway. I love you, I said, the words still new enough to feel momentous. James smiled, that full, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. I love you too, he said. Every day, every single day, I choose to love you. And sitting there in the spring sunshine, the world continuing its rotation, the flowers pushing toward light, I believed him, not because I was naive anymore, but because I'd learned to recognize the difference between performance and presence, between words and actions, between someone who divides their life and someone who offers it whole. The betrayal had almost destroyed me. The double life David had constructed had shattered every certainty I'd built my world on. But somehow, impossibly, it had also freed me to find someone who understood that real love doesn't hide, doesn't divide, doesn't require elaborate deceptions to maintain. Real love shows up, stays present, chooses you again and again in full daylight, with witnesses, with honesty that sometimes hurts but never deceives. I was 40 years old, divorced, teaching the same classes I'd taught for years, living in the same small town where everyone knew my story. But I was also more myself than I'd ever been. Stronger, clearer, no longer willing to accept crumbs and call it a feast. And beside me sat a man who'd been broken too, who understood that healing isn't linear, that some days you still fall apart, and that's okay because tomorrow you get to try again. If you're reading this, if you've been shattered by someone's choices, if you're sitting in the wreckage wondering if you'll ever feel whole again, I want you to know it's possible. Not easy, not quick, not without pain that feels like it might kill you, but possible. You'll find your own version of morning grace, your own James Hartwell, your own spring bench where you realize the story didn't end when you thought it did. It just turned into something you never expected, something harder and truer and worth every moment of the journey to get there. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that even the most painful betrayals can lead to unexpected grace, subscribe to this channel, because sometimes the stories that break us are the ones that show us we were always strong enough to rebuild.